They made fun of my cleaning job until the CEO called me Dad in front of everyone. I still remember the sting of their laughter, the way they looked at me like I was less than nothing, just the janitor, just the man with the mop. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know who I really was or who was watching. And when that moment came, the moment the most powerful man in the building spoke a single word that silenced the entire room, it changed everything. But before that day, my life looked very different. Every morning, long before the city had shaken off the night, I pushed open the heavy glass doors of that skyscraper. The air was always cold in the lobby, the kind of cold that didn't just live in the walls, but in the way people carried themselves inside. To most, it was just another office building. To me, it was the place where I fought a quiet war every single day, with my mop, my cart, and the weight of other people's judgment. The marble floors stretched out like mirrors, and I knew every inch of them. I knew which tiles carried scuff marks that never quite polished out. I knew where the lights flickered in the ceiling. I knew the hum of the vending machine that never shut off, and the faint smell of coffee that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. This building had secrets, but so did I. My uniform was simple dark blue with my name stitched neatly above my chest. To me, it meant work. To me, it meant food on the table and bills that didn't go unpaid. But to them, to the men and women in crisp suits and heels that clicked like metronomes across my freshly polished floors, it meant failure. They didn't know my story. They didn't ask. To them, I was background noise, the man who emptied bins and scrubbed bathrooms while they made deals worth millions. They would walk past me without so much as a glance, except for when they wanted to laugh. I caught the whispers when they thought I was too far to hear. Probably dropped out of school. Mustveh made some bad choices to end up here. Poor guy, imagine being his age and still mopping floors. And sometimes they didn't even bother whispering. Sometimes they said it loud enough to sting. I'd be polishing the chrome handles by the elevator, and two of them would step in, smirking. Careful, one would say. Don't slip on the water the janitor missed. They'd laugh, like it was the funniest joke in the world. Like I wasn't even human. Do you know what it feels like to be invisible? To walk into a room and feel the air tighten, because your presence is unwelcome? I do. Every break room I entered, conversations cut short. Every corridor I passed through, eyes shifted away. It was like my uniform carried a curse, the curse of being beneath them. And yet, I kept moving. I kept working. Not because I was proud of being laughed at, but because life doesn't care about your pride when bills are due. Life doesn't care about your dignity when the fridge is empty. And I had long ago learned that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is bend his back and do the work no one else wants to touch. But don't mistake me, I wasn't weak. I wasn't broken. I carried my own kind of pride, but it was the silent kind. It was the kind that comes from knowing that every hour I worked, every floor I polished, wasn't just for me. It was for someone else, someone I had sacrificed everything for. And here's the cruelest part. The same people who laughed at me for mopping their floors had no idea that the most powerful man in that building, the CEO whose signature could change the direction of their entire careers, was tied to me in a way that would one day leave them speechless. But back then I was just the cleaner, just the janitor, just the old man with the mop and the squeaky cart. And yet, even as I scrubbed their footprints from the marble, I could feel something building inside me, a storm waiting for its moment, a truth waiting to be spoken. I didn't know when it would happen. I didn't know how. But I knew that one day, the same mouths that sneered at me would be forced into silence. One day, they'd see who I really was, but that day hadn't come yet. At that time, I was still invisible, still humiliated, still the target of jokes that grew sharper with every passing week. And then came the day when their laughter didn't just sting it cut so deep it nearly broke me. It started like any other day. I was pushing my cart down the hallway, the wheels squeaking against the polished floor, when I heard the sound of laughter. Laughter wasn't unusual in that building, but this time it was different. This time it was aimed at me. I had stopped outside one of the glass conference rooms to wipe a fingerprint from the door handle. Inside, a group of young employees sat around a long table, sipping lattes and scrolling through their phones while they waited for their meeting to start. They noticed me right away, but not in the way you'd notice another human being. They noticed me like you'd notice a smudge on your sleeve, something you'd point out, something you'd laugh about. "Hey, look," one of them said, his voice loud enough to carry through the glass. "There's our career plan if we mess up janitor for life." His friends burst into laughter, slapping each other on the back, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Another chimed in, "Don't forget the Mapultimate promotion tool." They roared again. I stood there, my rag frozen in my hand, pretending I couldn't hear them, pretending I was deaf to their cruelty. My chest burned, but I forced myself to keep wiping the glass, my reflection staring back at me with tired eyes. The laughter didn't stop. It followed me down the hall, spilling out of open doors and whispered snickers. Someone passed by and muttered, "Don't trip on your bucket, old man." Another added, "Smile. Maybe the CEO will notice and give you a raise 50 cents an hour." They thought they were clever. To them, I wasn't a person. I was entertainment. I wish I could say their words rolled off me like water. But the truth? That day, they cut deeper than usual. Maybe it was the way the whole group joined in, united in their mockery. Maybe it was the way their laughter echoed, filling every corner of the building until it felt like the walls themselves were laughing at me. Or maybe it was just because I was tired of being invisible, tired of being belittled, tired of carrying a secret that no one knew. I remember ducking into the supply closet and closing the door behind me. For a moment, I let my back press against the shelves, the smell of bleach and old rags surrounding me. My chest heaved, not from the work, but from holding everything in. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burst out of that closet and tell them who I really was, to shout the truth so loudly their smirks would vanish in an instant. But I didn't. I swallowed it down like I always did, because that truth wasn't ready yet, because the timing mattered. And yet, as I stood there in that cramped closet with their laughter still ringing in my ears, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. A quiet, steady fire that told me my day would come. They could laugh all they wanted. They could mock my uniform, my mop, my silence. But one day, the truth would make them choke on their own words. I picked up my rag again, straightened my back, and walked back into the hallway. Their laughter hadn't stopped, but something in me had changed. They thought they'd broken me. What they didn't know was that they had just sharpened my determination, because the truth was, the man they mocked, the man they dismissed as nothing more than a cleaner, wasn't as small as they believed. I had a connection none of them could have imagined. A connection that, once revealed, would silence every last one of them. What they didn't know was that the man at the top of that building, the one with the corner office and the power to change their futures with a single decision, wasn't just their boss. He was my son, and the day that truth came out, their laughter would die in their throats. For months I let them laugh. I let them point, whisper, and treat me like I was invisible. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that the man they mocked every morning was carrying a truth bigger than any of their job titles or salaries. A truth I guarded quietly, like a fragile flame I didn't dare expose to the wind too soon. Because the CEO, the man they bowed their heads for when he walked past, the man they rehearsed their words around, the man whose signature could decide their promotions or their firings, was my son, my flesh and blood, my boy. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? The janitor and the CEO, two men from completely different worlds bound together by something none of them could see. But life has a way of drawing strange lines, and our line, mine and his, had been drawn years before those glass doors ever opened to me. When my son was little, I was everything to him. I held his tiny hands as he took his first steps. I cheered at every school play, no matter how small his part was. I worked extra shifts so that he'd never feel the hunger I'd known as a child. And yet, life pulled me away from him in ways I couldn't control. His mother and I separated when he was young, and she moved to another state. I stayed behind not because I wanted to be away from him, but because I had to keep working. Somebody had to keep the lights on. Somebody had to send the checks that bought him clothes, books, and food. While she raised him day to day, I became the man in the background, the man who mailed support, the man who showed up when he could, the man who sacrificed quietly so his son could dream loudly. And he did dream. He dreamed bigger than I ever thought possible. College, business school, startups, failures, and, finally, success. He rose faster than anyone expected. He didn't just climb the ladder. He built his own. Until one day, he was standing at the very top, running the kind of company people wrote about in magazines. And me? I was still mopping floors, still pushing my cart, still carrying that silent pride. But here's the part no one in that building understood. I wasn't ashamed of cleaning. What cut deep wasn't the mop in my hands. It was the fact that my own son didn't know how much I had given up for him. We weren't close. Years of distance had left cracks in our bond. He knew I was there in the background, but he didn't know the weight I had carried to keep his future alive. So when I took the job in his company, yes, his company, I didn't tell anyone who I was. Not him, not the managers, not the employees who laughed at me. I walked in as just another janitor, because I didn't want favors. I didn't want a shortcut. I wanted to watch from the shadows, to see the man he had become with my own eyes. And maybe, deep down, I wanted to prove something too, that no matter how far apart we had grown, no matter how invisible I felt in his world, I was still part of his story. Every time I saw him in the lobby, surrounded by assistants and directors, my chest swelled. He looked sharp, confident, untouchable, and no one, not a single soul in that building, knew that I had once carried him on my shoulders through a park or tucked him into bed with a kiss on his forehead. They bowed to him as sir, but I had once called him son. Keeping that secret wasn't easy. Every time someone mocked me, every time I was dismissed like I didn't matter, I wanted to scream it. You don't know who I am. You don't know who you're laughing at. But I didn't. Because I knew the truth would come out one day, and when it did, it would be on my son's terms, not mine. And that day came faster than I expected. It came on the night of the company banquet, The night when every single person in that building would see me not as the cleaner they ridiculed, but as something they could never have imagined. The night of the banquet was the kind of night that the company lived for. Every year they hosted it at the Grand Hotel Ballroom, a place dripping with chandeliers and polished gold trim. It was their way of celebrating themselves, awards for top performers, speeches about growth and success, glasses clinking with expensive champagne. For most, it was a night to shine. For me, it was just another shift, another night with a mop and a broom. I arrived early, before the first guests had stepped out of their limousines. The smell of fresh flowers filled the air, roses and lilies placed on every table while the staff hurried to lay out silverware that gleamed like tiny mirrors. My job was simple: keep everything spotless. Invisible hands maintaining the illusion of perfection. That was me. Always invisible. But being invisible meant I could watch. And I did. I watched as the guests began to arrive, dressed in tuxedos and shimmering gowns. Laughter and chatter filled the room as they greeted each other with air kisses and handshakes, each smile just a little too polished, each laugh just a little too rehearsed. I knew what these nights were really about. It wasn't just about awards. It was about showing off, about proving who mattered most in that glittering room. I kept to the edges, cloth in hand, pretending to polish what was already clean. A few waiters nodded at me as they rushed by with trays of wine glasses, but no one else paid me any mind. Except, of course, for the ones who enjoyed making sure I remembered my place. At one point, a group of junior associates walked past me, their laughter bubbling with alcohol and arrogance. One of them glanced at my mop leaning against the wall and smirked. "Careful, guys. Don't spill anything. We don't want to give him too much work tonight." The others chuckled, tossing glances at me like I was part of the joke. Another added, "Maybe if we leave him a good tip, he'll let us slide if we drop something." Their laughter trailed off as they disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing there with a rag in my hand and a knot in my stomach. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to breathe. It was the same story, just a different stage. They thought their money and suits made them better than me, made me forget that I was a man with a story, with a past, with a truth bigger than their shallow arrogance. I let their words hang in the air and fall away, because tonight was bigger than them. Tonight, the masks they wore would crack. I moved closer to the back of the room, near the tall velvet curtains where the lights didn't reach. From there, I could see everything: the waiters weaving between tables, the executives raising their glasses, the managers leaning in close with fake smiles. And at the center of it all, the one man who carried the room with a single glance: my son. He entered with a quiet authority that made the crowd shift without a word. The laughter dimmed, the voices softened, and all eyes followed him as he walked toward the stage. He looked every bit the man the world believed him to be: confident, polished, untouchable. My chest tightened, not with shame, but with a strange mix of pride and distance. That was my boy, my blood, my son. And yet he stood there a world away from me. The announcer tapped the microphone, the speakers crackled, and the music faded. The time had come for the CEO's address. The room hushed, anticipation hanging thick in the air. I gripped my rag tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what he would say. I didn't know if tonight would pass like every other banquet, with me in the shadows, cleaning up spilled wine while the powerful applauded themselves. But something in me told me this night would be different. Something in me whispered that the truth I had carried for so long was about to be pulled into the light, whether I was ready for it or not. And then, as my son stepped onto the stage and looked out over the crowd, his eyes swept the room and landed on Meme, the janitor in the shadows. The corners of his mouth lifted, just slightly, but enough to send a jolt straight through my chest. In that moment, I knew. The masks were about to come off. The ballroom had gone silent. Hundreds of people sat at round tables draped in white linen, their eyes fixed on the man at the podium. My son stood tall in the spotlight, his presence commanding the room in a way that only true authority can. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and for a moment the only sound was the soft clink of a wine glass being set down somewhere in the back. I stood near the wall, half hidden behind the velvet curtains, cloth still in my hand. I wasn't supposed to be part of this moment. I was supposed to be invisible, blending into the background like the polished floor beneath their feet. But his eyes had already found me. He knew exactly where I was standing. He began his speech the way everyone expected, thanking the board, praising the employees, talking about the company's growth. The crowd nodded, clapped politely at all the right moments, raising their glasses when he mentioned record profits. They were eating it up, every carefully rehearsed word. And yet, I could see something else in his face, something the others couldn't. His jaw was set a little tighter. His voice carried an undercurrent of emotion, like he was holding back something heavier than corporate platitudes. Then it happened. He paused, scanning the room slowly. His words slowed. His eyes swept past the managers, the directors, the partners, and then returned to me. He didn't look away. He let the silence stretch until even the waiters stopped moving, trays frozen mid-air. "There's someone here tonight," he said, his voice deeper, steadier now. "Someone most of you don't know the way I do." A ripple moved through the crowd. People glanced at each other, curious, confused. I felt my stomach twist, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone must hear it. He went on. "Many of you have probably walked past him. Maybe some of you have even laughed at him. You saw a uniform, a mop, a man cleaning up after your messes. But what you didn't see was who he truly is." The room grew stiller than I thought possible. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to step back into the shadows, but my legs wouldn't move. He lifted his hand, pointing directly at me. The spotlight followed, cutting through the darkness, landing squarely on my chest. I blinked against the sudden brightness, every head in the room whipping around to follow his gaze. "That man," he said, voice ringing with pride, "is my father." The words crashed over the room like a wave. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Forks froze mid-air, glasses stopped halfway to lips, mouths hung open in disbelief. The same people who had smirked at me in the hallways now stared wide-eyed, their laughter stolen clean out of their throats. And then he said it, the word I hadn't heard from him in years, the word that stripped the masks from every face in that room. Dad. The sound of it shattered me. In front of everyone his board, his partners, his employees, my son had called me Dad. Not janitor, not cleaner, not invisible. Dad. I felt the sting of tears rising, blurring the blinding light of the spotlight. My rag slipped from my hand and hit the floor. I couldn't breathe for a moment. All I could do was stand there, trembling, as the weight of those 3 letters filled the ballroom. The silence was deafening. And then, one by one, heads began to bow. Eyes dropped to the tablecloths, faces flushed with shame. The same people who mocked me couldn't bear to look at me now. My son didn't stop there. He stepped out from behind the podium, his voice stronger now. This man taught me everything I know about hard work. He gave up his own dreams so I could chase mine. Every late night he worked, every sacrifice he made, he did it for me. So before you call him just a janitor again, remember this. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here today. The room erupted not with laughter, not with sneers, but with thunderous applause. Chairs scraped back as people rose to their feet, clapping, some even wiping their eyes. The sound shook the walls. And me? I stood frozen in the spotlight, my heart breaking open with pride, shame, love, and relief all tangled into one. For years, I had carried the secret of who I was, and now, in a single word, my son had revealed it to the world. The man they mocked, the man they dismissed, was no longer invisible. I was Dad. The applause rolled through the ballroom like a storm, waves of sound crashing against the glittering chandeliers and echoing off the walls until it felt like the whole world was clapping. For a moment, I thought the ground itself was shaking under my feet. It wasn't polite applause, the kind you hear after a speech that people half listen to. Not this was heavy, thunderous, drawn out, almost desperate. It filled every corner of that golden room and wrapped itself around me until I couldn't tell if my chest was swelling from pride or breaking under the weight of it all. I had never been in the spotlight before. I had always existed in the shadows of that building by the trash cans, in the empty offices after everyone left, in the bathrooms with the echo of dripping faucets as my only company. And now, suddenly, I was standing under a light so bright it burned. Faces that had never once looked at me were all turned my way. For the first time, every single person in that room saw me. Not the mop, not the uniform, me. But it wasn't just the sound of the applause that got to me. It was the expressions, the looks plastered across their faces as they clapped. The same mouths that had smirked at me in hallways were now twisted with something else. Guilt, shame, disbelief. Some clapped hard, their eyes wet, as though clapping could erase the words they'd once thrown my way. Others clapped stiffly, glancing at each other, trying to gauge if this new respect was genuine or just required in the moment. And a few couldn't even meet my gaze at all. They stared at their tablecloths, red creeping up their necks, their claps hollow and weak. It hit me then how quickly people can change their tune. Hours ago, they would have laughed if I had spilled a drink or tripped over my cart. Hours ago, they wouldn't have given me a second thought. And now, because of one word, because the CEO had called me Dad, they were applauding as if I had been a king in disguise all along. And that thought, God, that thought burned inside me. Why had it taken this? Why had it taken my son's status, his power, for them to see me as human? Hadn't I always been worth respect? Hadn't my years of hard work, of showing up day after day, already earned me dignity? Wasn't being a man who worked with his hands, who provided in silence, enough? The applause grew louder, some people rising to their feet now, clapping with a force that bordered on frantic. I watched as men in $1,000 suits stood shoulder to shoulder with assistants in modest dresses, all of them unified in their clapping. For a moment, it was like a performance not for me, but for themselves. A performance of remorse, of newfound respect. Respect born not out of choice, but out of necessity. And yet, through all the bitterness and questions tearing through me, I felt something else too. Pride. Not in them, not in their sudden change of heart, but in my son. Because while their applause might have been shallow, his words had not been. He hadn't needed to say what he said. He hadn't needed to call me out of the shadows, to pull me into the light. But he did, and he did it with pride, with love, with a conviction so strong that it silenced a room full of people who thought they owned the world. I felt my throat tighten, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to hold them back, but the dam inside me was cracking. Every cruel word I had swallowed, every night I had walked home with aching bones and an empty stomach. Every humiliation I had endured in silence, it all rose up inside me as that applause shook the walls. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel small. I felt seen, truly seen. But even in that moment, I couldn't help but think about the irony. How many of those clapping hands had once pointed at me? How many of those wide eyes had once narrowed in disgust as they passed me in the hallway? And now they wanted to erase it all with applause. A part of me wanted to shout at them, to call them out for every cruel word, every sneer, every laugh they had hidden behind their hands. But I stayed quiet, because the truth was I didn't need to. The shame written on their faces was louder than anything I could have said. I bent down slowly, my hands trembling, and picked up the rag I had dropped. It was just a small square of cloth, stained from hours of scrubbing tables and polishing glass, but in that moment it felt heavier than a crown. I held it in my fist, clutching it like it was a piece of my very soul. This rag had been my companion, my shield, my proof of endurance. And now, standing in the spotlight, I realized it wasn't a symbol of humiliation. It was a symbol of survival. The applause finally began to die down, claps fading into scattered echoes until silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence I had known before, the cold silence of being ignored, the empty silence of invisibility. This silence was different. It was weighted, thick, full of unspoken words, respect, regret, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of awe. I lifted my head, letting my eyes sweep across the room. People flinched when my gaze landed on them, their clapping hands now resting awkwardly on the table. No one dared laugh. No one dared whisper. The same people who had once treated me like dirt now couldn't even hold my gaze. And then I looked back at my son. He was still standing at the edge of the stage, his eyes locked on mine. His expression wasn't for the crowd, it was for me alone. And what I saw there was everything I had ever hoped to see in him. Pride, love, and gratitude. His lips trembled slightly, his chest rising and falling with the weight of unspoken emotion. He didn't have to say another word for me to know what he was feeling. But he wasn't finished. I could see it in the way he squared his shoulders, in the way he stepped closer to the microphone with purpose. The applause had silenced the room, but his next words would break it wide open. He wasn't done telling my story. He wasn't done telling them who I really was, and I wasn't ready for what came next. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. This silence was heavy, almost reverent, like the pause before a church choir begins to sing. All eyes were still on me, but I knew that silence wasn't mine to hold, it was his. My son, the man on the stage, the CEO who had just turned an entire ballroom upside down with one word. He stepped closer to the microphone, resting his hands on either side of the podium. His face had changed. The polished corporate mask he always wore in public was gone. In its place was something raw, something vulnerable, something only a son looking at his father could carry. I know many of you are surprised, he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, maybe even shocked. You've walked these halls. You've seen this man, and you thought you knew who he was. To you, he was just a janitor, just another worker cleaning up after you. But to me, he paused, letting the silence breathe, scanning the room before turning back to me. To me, he's everything. A murmur rippled through the tables. Some leaned forward, hands clasped, waiting for more. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as if the truth he was laying bare was a mirror they didn't want to look into. My son continued, his voice growing stronger, more certain with every word. What you don't know is that every success I've had, every step I've taken, every door I've walked through, it wasn't built on my effort alone. It was built on his sacrifices. My father worked jobs most people would turn their noses up at. He broke his back so I wouldn't have to. He gave up his dreams so that I could chase mine. I felt my knees weaken, my chest tight. He had never said those words to me before, not in private, not in public. To hear them now, in front of all these people, was almost too much. He gripped the podium tighter, his voice rising with intensity. You see a man with a mop. I see the man who taught me what real work looks like. You see someone in a uniform. I see the man who showed me that dignity has nothing to do with the clothes you wear. You see a janitor. I see the reason I'm standing here today. A hush fell over the room, deeper than before. I could see the shame sinking into their faces, their eyes flicking between him and me. My son's words were stripping away the illusions they had built around status, money, and titles. Every sentence was a blade cutting through arrogance. He paused, letting his words sink in, then stepped away from the podium. His voice softened, but somehow carried even further. When I was a boy, I didn't understand. I thought he was just tired, just working too much. But now I know the truth. He was building me. Every late night, every missed meal, every dollar he saved. He was laying bricks for the foundation of my future. And tonight, I want to say publicly what I should have said long ago. Dad, thank you. The words hit me like a tidal wave. My vision blurred as tears spilled freely down my cheeks. For years, I had wondered if he saw me, if he remembered, if he understood. And now, here he was, telling a room full of people what I had carried alone in silence. I could hear sniffles now, scattered across the ballroom. Executives dabbed their eyes with napkins. Waiters paused mid-step, tears shining in their eyes. Even the ones who had mocked me the loudest sat with their faces lowered, broken by the truth they couldn't deny. My son turned back to the crowd, his voice taking on an edge of steel. So the next time you think about mocking someone because of the job they do, remember this moment. Remember this man. Without him, none of this would exist. Without him, I wouldn't be here. Respect isn't about titles. It's about sacrifice, it's about character, and it's about love. He stepped away from the podium entirely now, standing tall, his hands clenched at his sides. The silence after his words was deafening, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something new, awareness, humility, and the weight of truths they could never unhear. And then, as if the dam broke all over again, the applause returned, louder than before, fiercer. It wasn't polite this time. It wasn't even desperate. It was reverent, a standing ovation that shook the very foundation of that ballroom. And I stood there trembling, clutching the rag in my hand, tears streaming down my face. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the man in the shadows. I didn't feel invisible. I felt like a father whose son had not only seen him but honored him. But even as the applause rose to the heavens, I knew this night when finished. Because after the speeches and the ovations, there would come a quieter moment. A moment where it would just be me and him, and the words we had never spoken to each other before. The banquet ended hours later, but for me, time moved in slow motion. The applause had faded, the speeches were over, the lights dimmed as people filtered out into the night, their shoes clicking against marble floors, their voices hushed with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Waiters cleared empty glasses and half-eaten desserts, the scent of wine and roasted meat still lingering in the air. The room that had once roared with laughter and arrogance now carried only the soft echoes of footsteps and the rustle of tablecloths being folded away. I lingered by the edge of the ballroom, unsure of where to go. I felt exposed, raw, like a man who had been stripped bare in front of strangers. For years, I had carried my pride in silence, hidden behind a mop and a cart, and now here I was, laid open for all to see. My son had spoken truths that even I had buried deep inside, truths I wasn't sure I was ready to face. And then I felt a hand on my shoulder, firm, steady. I turned, and there he was. No spotlight, no podium, no board of directors watching his every move, just my son. The boy I had once rocked to sleep, the boy I had once cheered for at Little League games. Now a grown man in a tailored suit with eyes that shimmered not with power, but with something far more fragile. "Dad," he said softly, and the word hit me harder than when he'd spoken it into the microphone. It wasn't meant for the crowd this time. It was meant for me. For us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, two men who had been separated by years of distance, silence, and unspoken pain. The noise of the staff cleaning up around us faded until it felt like the room belonged only to us. "I'm sorry," he whispered finally, his voice breaking. "I should have said it sooner. I should have told you years ago." My chest tightened. I had imagined this moment so many times, what I would say if he ever came to me with those words. Would I scold him for forgetting me? Would I demand answers for the years of silence? Would I let my bitterness spill out and drown us both? But standing there, looking into his eyes, all I felt was love. All I saw was my boy. "You don't need to be sorry," I said, my voice low and shaking. "You made me proud every step of the way, even when I wasn't beside you. I worked, I sacrificed, because I wanted you to have the life I couldn't. That's all I ever wanted, son. That's all I ever needed." Tears slipped down his cheeks, and for the first time in decades, I saw not the CEO, not the man in charge of an empire, but the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. He stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. A real hug. Not the stiff, polite embraces of businessmen, but the kind that breaks down walls, the kind that stitches wounds that have been open too long. I clung to him, my arms tight around his back, the rag still clutched in my fist. I didn't care if the waiters saw, if anyone walked in. In that moment, I wasn't the janitor, and he wasn't the CEO. We were just father and son, finding each other again after years of silence. "I didn't understand back then," he said into my shoulder. "I didn't know how much you gave up. I didn't see it. But tonight I needed them to know. I needed everyone to see you the way I do now." I pulled back, cupping his face with both my hands, my thumbs brushing away the tears. "You don't need a room full of people to see me. You're the only one who needed to. and now you do. That's enough." We stood there, eyes locked, both of us crying but neither ashamed of it. For years I had wondered if I had failed him, if my absence during his childhood had left scars that couldn't heal. But in that moment I realized the truth: he had carried me with him all along, even when I thought he had forgotten me. My sacrifices had not been invisible. They had built him, shaped him, made him who he was, and now, finally, he was giving them back in the only way that mattered: by honoring me. He straightened his suit, wiped his face, and smiled at me, a smile not of a CEO, not of a man used to power, but of a son who had finally come home. "From now on," he said, "he'll never let anyone forget who you are. Not them, not me." I nodded, my own smile trembling through the tears. "I don't need them to remember. Just you." For the first time in a long time, the weight I had carried lifted off my shoulders. The years of humiliation, the sting of mockery, the loneliness of being invisible, all of it faded in the warmth of that moment. I didn't need applause. I didn't need recognition. I had my son back, and that was everything. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't quite over. The reconciliation between us was real, yes, but there was still the rest of the world to face. The same people who had once laughed at me would have to live with the truth of who I was and who I had always been. The banquet had ended, but my heart was still racing as though the applause was echoing inside my chest. The tables were half cleared now, the champagne glasses empty, the scent of roasted meat and spiced desserts still hanging faintly in the air. Waiters moved quietly around the room, sweeping crumbs into trays, stacking chairs, folding tablecloths. Their footsteps and hushed voices were like background noise, fading in and out, as if the universe had decided to dim everything else so I could focus on one truth. The truth I had waited years to feel. I stayed near the edge of the ballroom, half hidden in the shadows where I had always belonged. For so long, my place had been the corners, the closets, the spaces where no one looked twice. That night had dragged me into the spotlight, stripped away my invisibility, and yet I found myself retreating again, unsure of how to carry the weight of it all. It felt too much, too sudden, and then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, not a tap, not a casual brush, firm, solid, grounding. I turned, and there he was, my son. No spotlight on him now, no microphone, no board of directors hanging on his words, just him. Just the boy I had once taught to ride a bike in the cracked driveway of our old neighborhood. The boy I had once carried on my shoulders at the fair, his laughter louder than the carnival rides. The boy I had kissed goodnight, even on nights when my hands were raw from work and I could barely keep my eyes open. Now he stood in front of me, not as that boy, but as a man, taller than me, sharper in his suit than I could have ever imagined, and yet still my son. His eyes, though red from emotion, still carried that same spark I had known since the day he was born. "Dad," he said softly, just one word. But this time, it wasn't for the crowd. It wasn't for applause or recognition. It was for me, for us. That single word, whispered so gently, carried more power than all the clapping in the world. It reached into every hidden corner of me that had longed to be seen, and it broke me open. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my chest aching with everything I wanted to say but could not. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, locked in a silence that carried years of distance, missed birthdays, broken phone calls, and all the words that had gone unsaid. Finally, his lips trembled, and he whispered, "I'm sorry." His voice cracked like a boy's, not like a CEO's. I should have said it sooner. I should have told you years ago." The words cut deep, not because they hurt, but because they healed. I had dreamt of hearing them, but never thought I would. My mind flashed with memories, the nights I had stood in empty kitchens counting dollar bills to make sure he had enough. The times I had patched holes in my shoes so I could afford to buy him new ones. The jobs I had taken where dignity was stripped from me but the paychecks bought him another chance. I had done it all without expectation of thanks. But now, hearing him apologize, it felt like every bruise on my soul finally had a reason. I wanted to tell him everything. That I had never hated him. That I had never blamed him. That every sacrifice was a choice I would make again, 1,000 times over. My throat burned as I finally found the words. "You don't need to be sorry," I said, my voice low and trembling. "You made me proud every step of the way, even when I wasn't beside you. I worked, I sacrificed, because I wanted you to have the life I couldn't. That's all I ever wanted, son. That's all I ever needed." He broke then. His shoulders shook as tears slipped down his cheeks, his face crumpling under the weight of years he had carried silently. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a hug so fierce, so desperate, it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. I dropped the rag still clenched in my hand and held him tight, my arms gripping him as though letting go would mean losing him all over again. It wasn't the kind of hug you give out of habit. It wasn't polite or casual. It was the kind of hug that mends, the kind that knits broken pieces back together. In that moment, we weren't janitor and CEO. We weren't separated by titles, distance, or silence. We were simply father and son. His voice cracked against my shoulder. I didn't understand back then. I didn't know how much you gave up. I didn't see it. But tonight, I needed them to know. I needed everyone to see you the way I do now. I pulled back, cupping his face in both hands. His tears met mine, falling together like rivers finally finding their way to the same ocean. "You don't need a room full of people to see me," I whispered. "You're the only one who needed to. And now you do. That's enough." We stood there for a long time, two men crying without shame, and for the first time in years, I felt the invisible walls between us crumble. I had feared for so long that my absence had scarred him, that my sacrifices had left him bitter or broken. But looking at him now, hearing his words, I realized something I had been blind to all along. He had carried me with him, in his drive, in his work, in his heart. I was always there, even when I thought I had been forgotten. He straightened, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and smiled at me, a smile stripped of power, stripped of pride, pure and simple. A son's smile. "From now on," he said firmly, "I'll never let anyone forget who you are. Not them. Not me." My own smile trembled as I nodded. "I don't need them to remember," I said. "Just you." And in that moment, I knew I had him back. Not the CEO, not the man in the spotlight. My son. And nothing else mattered. The years of humiliation, the sting of their mockery, the endless nights of aching bones, all of it faded. I didn't need the ballroom's applause. I didn't need the company's respect. I had what I had been waiting for all along, the voice of my son calling me Dad. But deep down, I knew this story wasn't quite over. The reconciliation between us was real, but the next morning I would return to that building. The same hallways, the same marble floors, the same faces that once mocked me. Only this time, everything would be different. The morning after the banquet, I woke up before the sun rose, just as I always did. The alarm buzzed in the dark, and my body moved almost on instinct. I washed my face, buttoned up the same faded uniform, and laced my shoes with fingers rough from years of tying knots too tightly. Outside, the air was cool and sharp, dew clinging to the grass, the streets still empty except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Everything looked the same, but inside, I knew the world had shifted. I pushed my cart into the lobby, the wheels squeaking like always, the mop handle rattling in its slot. The marble floors gleamed under the morning light pouring through the tall glass windows. The security guard at the front desk, a man who usually just gave me a bored nod without looking up from his crossword puzzle, actually stood when he saw me. "Morning, sir," he said, his voice almost too polite. "Sir." That one word caught me off guard. I nodded back, though the weight of that word lingered as I pushed forward. It wasn't long before I felt them, yes, dozens of them. Everywhere I turned, people watched me. They tried to make it subtle, but I could feel the difference. These weren't the quick, dismissive glances I was used to, the kind that skimmed over me as if I were part of the furniture. These looks were heavier, longer, filled with something they weren't used to giving me: attention. I turned a corner into the main hallway where the junior associates usually gathered with their coffees. Normally, I'd catch snickers or whispers, someone tossing out a careless remark about my mop, my shoes, or the wrinkles in my shirt. But today, their chatter fell quiet the moment I appeared. They straightened, some even stepping aside to give me room to pass. One of them, a young man with slicked hair who had once joked loudly that my mop was the ultimate promotion tool, actually cleared his throat and said, "Good morning, sir." I stopped for just a second, locking eyes with him. His face flushed, and he dropped his gaze to the floor. I gave a small nod, then pushed my cart forward. Inside, I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. "Sir?" The same mouth that once mocked me now stumbled over respect. In the break room, two women who had often laughed together as I emptied their trash cans froze mid-conversation when I walked in. Their voices died in their throats, their smiles faltered. One of them stood, shifting awkwardly, and whispered, "Mr. Good morning." The other looked down at her hands, twisting her ring nervously. I filled the water jug as I always did, the same routine, but the silence in that room was so loud it pressed against my ears. Later, in the elevator, a group of interns stood stiffly in the corners as I wheeled my cart inside. Normally, they'd ignore me, carrying on with their conversations as though I wasn't even there. Sometimes they'd chuckle, whispering about the smell of bleach or the creak of my cartwheels. But not today. One of them, a young woman holding a notebook against her chest, pressed the button for my floor without me asking. Her voice cracked as she said, "Which floor, sir?" The others avoided my eyes completely, their faces pale with the memory of laughter that no longer felt funny. As the elevator climbed, I caught my reflection in the shiny metal doors. Same uniform, same tired eyes, same cart. And yet, for the first time, I was invisible. The irony of it all nearly made me smile. Nothing about me had changed, but because of one word everything about the way they saw me had shifted overnight. And that thought cut deep. Because as much as I wanted to savor their shame, I couldn't ignore the bitter truth underneath. Why had it taken this? Why had it taken my son's power, his title, for them to see me as more than a shadow in the hallway? Why was respect something they only gave when it was forced out of them? I pushed my cart slowly down the corridor, listening to the whispers trail behind me. That's him, the CEO's father. Can you imagine? Their words weren't cruel this time. They were filled with awe, disbelief, even reverence. But still, they weren't words of genuine respect. They were words born of fear, of guilt, of the sudden realization that the man they had mocked wasn't who they thought he was. For a moment, bitterness rose inside me. I thought of every cruel remark, every smirk, every time I had ducked into a supply closet just to breathe and swallow my pride. And now, these same mouths wanted to rewrite their history with me. They wanted to clap, bow their heads, and pretend they hadn't once treated me like dirt. But as the bitterness simmered, I thought of my son. I thought of the way he had looked at me on that stage, eyes full of pride, voice shaking with truth. I thought of the way he had hugged me, broken down the walls of silence, called me Dad in front of the whole world. And I realized something important. Their respect wasn't what mattered. His was. His had always been the only one that mattered. Still, I couldn't deny the shift in the air as I walked through the building. Managers who had brushed past me before now nodded stiffly when I entered their offices. Senior staff who had once ignored me in the cafeteria now stood to the side, letting me pass first. Even the executives, the ones in $1,000 suits who used to treat me like I was invisible, greeted me with forced smiles. "Morning," one of them said, his voice low and uneasy, as though the word tasted foreign in his mouth. For years, I had walked these halls bent under the weight of invisibility. For years, I had endured their mockery in silence. And now, with a single truth revealed, I was no longer just the janitor. I was the father of the man who controlled their futures. But as I pushed my cart, the rag hanging from its edge, I smiled quietly to myself. Not because of their stares, not because of their sudden attempts at respect, but because I finally understood something. My worth had never been tied to them. Not their words, not their laughter, not their clapping hands. My worth had always been in my sacrifices, my love, my hands that worked so my son could rise. I had been enough all along, they were just too blind to see it. And though I didn't need their respect, I could feel the justice of it pressing into the air. Every time they saw me, they would remember. They would remember their laughter, their cruelty, and the way the truth had crushed their arrogance. Their shame would follow them like a shadow. But even as I savored that quiet justice, I knew this wasn't the end. Because my son wasn't finished with me yet. I had seen it in his eyes at the banquet. The speech, the applause, it was only the beginning. He had more to say to me, more to give. And soon he would call me into his world. Not as a janitor, but as his father. The days after the banquet felt like stepping into a different world, even though nothing had really changed. The same glass doors slid open when I walked in. The same polished marble greeted me in the lobby. The same squeaky cart rolled beside me, carrying the same mop and bucket I'd pushed for years. But the air was different, heavier. Eyes followed me everywhere I went. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I'd been invisible for so long that the sudden attention felt unnatural, almost suffocating. But no, it was real. The whispers trailed behind me. The stares lingered too long. The voices softened when I passed. People who used to snicker now avoided eye contact, their faces flushed with guilt. Others forced smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, as if pretending this was how they had always treated me. One morning, a young man known of the loudest voices in the group that had mocked me in the conference room weeks before crossed paths with me near the elevators. He froze, his usual smirk gone, replaced with something almost like fear. "Good morning, sir," he muttered, his voice low. Sir. He had never said that word to me in his life. I gave him a nod, not out of pettiness, but because I didn't need to say more. The shame already weighed heavily on his shoulders. In the cafeteria, the two women who once whispered about me while I cleaned their tables stood when I entered. They actually stood, as if I had suddenly become someone worth rising for. Would you like to sit?" one asked nervously, gesturing toward their table. I shook my head gently, poured my coffee, and went about my work. Their eyes followed me the entire time, filled with the awkwardness of people who wanted to erase the past but couldn't. And then there were the executives, the ones in the expensive suits who had once brushed past me as if I were a shadow on the wall. Now they nodded. They greeted me. One even held the door for me, his hand trembling slightly on the handle as though he wasn't sure how to look me in the eye. The irony was almost laughable. These men, so proud, so powerful in their own minds, were now tripping over themselves to show courtesy to the janitor they had once ignored. But here's the truth I discovered in those days. Their respect didn't matter. Not really, because it wasn't real. It wasn't earned through understanding or compassion, it was forced out of them by the truth they could no longer deny. Their respect was not for the man who had mopped their floors. It was for the title of the man who had called me Dad. It was respect built on borrowed power. And yet, despite that bitter truth, something had shifted in me. For years, I had let their mockery weigh me down. I had let their sneers convince me that I was invisible, that I was less. But that night in the ballroom had ripped away the lie. Not because of their applause, not because of their shame, but because of my son. Because he had finally seen me. Because he had finally told the world what I had always known but never dared to speak. That my worth was not measured by the mop in my hand, but by the sacrifices I had made with those hands. I began to walk differently through that building, my back a little straighter, my head a little higher. I wasn't strutting. I wasn't gloating. It wasn't about pride. It was about peace. I finally carried the truth inside me that no one could take away. I had been enough all along. Their laughter had never changed that. Their shame couldn't erase it now. And as I pushed my cart down those halls, I thought about all the others like meth janitors, the cleaners, the waiters, the cashiers, the workers whose hands grow rough so someone else's life can be smooth. I thought of how often we are dismissed, laughed at, and treated as invisible simply because society has convinced itself that only titles and salaries deserve respect. But that is the great lie. Dignity doesn't come from a title. It doesn't come from a paycheck. It doesn't come from the corner office or the fancy suit. Dignity comes from love, from sacrifice, from resilience, from showing up day after day, no matter how hard, no matter how thankless. That is what makes a person worthy of respect. If you have ever been mocked for the work you do, if you've ever been looked down on because of the clothes you wear, if you've ever been made to feel invisible because your name isn't etched on a golden plaque outside an office, hear me now. Don't believe their lies. Your value does not shrink because others are blind to it. They mocked me. They laughed at the janitor they thought was beneath them. But when the CEO stood on that stage, when he pointed to me in front of everyone, when he called me Dad, the room froze. The laughter died. And the truth was undeniable. Respect isn't earned by what you do. Respect is earned by who you are. And that night, in front of all those people, they finally understood it. The man they had laughed at, the man they had treated as invisible, had been carrying a truth bigger than their arrogance could ever imagine. They mocked the janitor. But they stood for the Father, and I knew, as I walked those halls again, they would never laugh at me the same way again.